All righty. Well, thank you for joining today. My name is Clever, and I am the partner relationship manager at ByteSpeed. We're joined here by my two friends from Arctic Wolf, Mitchell and Damon. They'll speak a little bit later and introduce themselves further. But ByteSpeed um, partnered with Arctic Wolf more recently to tackle cybersecurity needs that school districts across the country had. But I'll start off a little bit just reminding you about the history of ByteSpeed in case you're not as familiar. So we've been in business since 1999. We started out custom building desktops and servers, sending big white beige or beige boxes across the country. And schools grew to love us, not really because of the size of the boxes, but more so the service that we'd give. Free shipping, free imaging, free asset tagging. And so over the years, schools would come back to us and say, hey, you all do a great job getting desktops into our classrooms, our offices, and servers. Can you do more infrastructure, cybersecurity, et cetera? So fast forward to today, we provide enterprise networking solutions and IT services nationwide, and all kinds of security solutions as well. So you may be wondering what really makes ByteSpeed unique. You probably get a ton of emails every day from all kinds of resellers. ByteSpeed doesn't send them too often, so we're not the ones clogging up your inbox that much. But I will say we have a whole slew of in-house technicians that really are an extension of your team. We know you may not have the luxury of having as many technical folks as you would like to take care of everything. But we like to, work hand in hand with you. You're not just purchasing a one-time thing from us. We look at it as we're there for the long haul, for you to rely on us, go over and beyond what maybe everyone else would do. So anyway, we like to say we're big enough to serve you and small enough to care, but with industry-leading warranties. Our core stuff comes with 5-year warranty, 2 more years extra than what you'd get with typical Dells, Lenovo's, etc., and lifetime tech support. We're really flexible. We can custom image your machines, adding all your favorite software types and things like that. We offer a 30-day risk-free evaluation of our technology and free shipping. We can also provide an on-site parts closet for quantity purchases, again, with that free lifetime tech support that I spoke about. So now moving more closer to our subject for today, our partnership with Vita Learn really helps us understand the needs of schools, and Arctic Wolf has proven to be a trusted partner in helping us address cybersecurity needs that schools have. Um, and we really try to make sure you don't navigate the cybersecurity ever-changing landscape alone. So together we help districts with consortium-based pricing. So Arctic Wolf offers really good technology and beyond just technology service, right? And they are very closely aligned with us to really make sure what we're offering meets the budgets and meet, school districts where they're at and what they're able to do. Um, and really the other last piece I'd like to mention is the importance of simplicity. So simplicity in planning for your cybersecurity deployment and the overall decision-making process. So at this point, I would like to hand it over to these good-looking guys here, Damon and Mitch. Not often do people look like they do on their pictures, but let Damon and Mitch here take it over and just kind of share more about how they can be a resource for you.
Yeah, appreciate that, Clever. We've had a great relationship with ByteSpeed. We align closely, so many of the things that they're interested in doing around both physical and cybersecurity. We kind of form that yin and yang piece and the idea of the cybersecurity. Um, but what I really want to talk about today is the context of like, hey, where are we in the market right now? What trends has Arctic Wolf seen? To give myself a little introduction, my name is Mitch Wolf. I'm an engineer here at Arctic Wolf. So my role is really to give kind of the technical reasoning to how and why we do what we do from a technical aspect. But Arctic Wolf is kind of a unique place where, you know, if you're an engineer at Arctic Wolf, you also are cognizant in thinking about, insurability and cybersecurity best practice frameworks and trends in the marketplace. So that's really what I want to be talking about for the rest of this presentation. I'm joined today by my partner, Damon. I'll let Damon do a little introduction here.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Damon Longstreet. I'm the account representative that covers the area. I've been working with organizations in New England for over 5 years and helping them with their security needs. We have a great presentation for you today, and Mitch is going to take you through that journey of what that looks like. And to double tap on what Clever had mentioned as a call to action at the end, I will talk about ways that you can think about how do I implement this for our school district? How can we take advantage of the ByteSpeed, Vita Learn, and Arctic Wolf partnership? I'll talk about that to finish off today's discussion. So appreciate everybody's time.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit about our agenda, the real effort that I want to put forth today is talking about the cybersecurity landscape. Obviously we want to earn your business at Arctic Wolf, and we think we have some really great services and solutions that can address a lot of the common challenges that the education space is facing. That being said, I want this to be a conversation that is somewhat agnostic to Arctic Wolf about generalized trends. So whether you're evaluating us at Arctic Wolf and what we do, or you're evaluating us against other vendors in the marketplace or other service providers, these are going to be some kind of like what I would call big picture ideas of, hey, what should I be looking for when I try to figure out, is this organization I'm considering partnering with, are they on the cutting edge of security? Do they understand the landscape at a macro level? So we're going to talk a little bit about what we call the stages of security maturity. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Arctic Wolf services address those at some different key points. And then I'd love to talk a little bit about any questions that the audience has, and talk a little bit about like what potential next steps would be if you're interested in learning more. So to kick things off, who is Arctic Wolf, and why should you be listening to Damon and I? We're kind of a unique organization. One of the things that I always talk about is people ask us if we're at, Vermont Fest, or we're speaking to an education audience. People say, "Oh yeah, I know Arctic Wolf. You guys are a security company." And I always kind of pump the brakes there. I say, "Hold on, we do security, but really the way we think of ourselves is we're a security operations company." And that's kind of a loaded statement, but what I'm really trying to get at is we are really hyper cognizant of, hey, how are people going to actually use these tools and solutions and services, and how do they get value out of them? So we're very cognizant to the human piece, and that really dovetails nicely when you're talking to the education space, where teams are strapped for budget, strapped for time, oftentimes spinning multiple plates. We have over 10,000 customers in our customer base. The key piece that I really want to stress is that we have over 1,000 security engineers and analysts just in our SOC. So we actually have the largest commercial SOC that you can hire. The only SOC bigger than us in North America is actually the Department of Defense, and can't really hire those folks. We operate at what I would call the luxury of scale. And what I mean by that is that we're able to dedicate human eyes on glass in a lot of areas that other companies can't. They're trying to automate their way out of problems. We're using AI and machine learning to look at the data we have access to. But at the end of the day, it's the human nuance, the human perception that really fuels the critical decisions like containing an endpoint at 3 a.m. that are the actions that we can take to give you round-the-clock coverage. From an engineering perspective, the thing that I really like to mention is the 10 trillion events per week, and the 1,500 IR engagements per year. So we have access to an enormous amount of data, and I'll talk a little bit more about our platform and why that matters to you. But we see a vast amount of data from our existing customers. What we do then is we actually have an entire threat intelligence division. And I want to be very clear on that. They're called Arctic Wolf Labs. It's a separate division within our company. We take threat intelligence very seriously. We are not just making the threat intelligence effort be a part of, the side hustle of the SOC or triage team, or kind of like a pet project that gets updated when we have time. this is really an initiative that we take seriously. And that team then goes to work actioning the vast telemetry into some bite-sized takeaways. And we produce a report off of that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The other way that we're able to understand the security landscape and how it changes at a very high rate of speed is through those 1,500 IR engagements per year. So the idea behind the 1,500 engagements per year, those are non-Arctic Wolf customers that unfortunately have that worst day of their career. They have a business email compromise attack. They have a data exfiltration. They have a ransomware encryption event. They oftentimes panic and they go to the market, oftentimes calling their cyber insurance provider and saying, hey, who can help me with this? We're one of the trusted advisors. We sit on the panel of actually every major cyber insurance provider as an organization that can help you get back up and running if the worst were to occur. So from those different data sets, we have recently produced the 2026 Arctic Wolf Labs threat report. And what this threat report really does is it does a couple different things. We take that threat intelligence team and we have them synthesize down, hey, what have we learned from the 1,500 plus IR engagements we did over the past calendar year? And on top of that, when we look at just the individual, data packets and observations and occurrences that are occurring to normal Arctic Wolf customers, what is that telling us about the landscape? And we produce this report each year. And as a takeaway, if anyone in the audience wants access to this report, you can get it on our website, or I'd be happy to send it as a follow-up. But there's a couple actionable things that we then list into not just takeaways and trends and observations, but maybe more importantly for the people in this audience, what you can actually do about them. So I'm going to be talking about those trends and how those fit into the education space and really the K through 12 industry in general, based on the challenges that you likely are facing. Two of the key things, I know that cybersecurity can seem kind of daunting, and it seems like there's so many, niche tools being thrown at niche problems, and they all require, new budget and new spend. But I would kind of like to start this on a positive note. There's two key quotes that jumped out at me a couple weeks ago when this report debuted that I think are worth talking about. So the first one is, the past year has reinforced a lesson defenders often learn the hard way. Attackers don't need new tricks when the old ones still work. I think so many people that are security professionals and IT professionals, they assume that, every cyber attack, it's like a CSI episode, right? There's someone that's doing a novel zero-day attack to make that attack successful. Really, the opposite is true. So often, Damon and I talk to people that unfortunately have had a breach recently and that are coming to Arctic Wolf to talk to us about it. And we end up finding out that, the CVE that was their downfall, it oftentimes has a 2023 date stamp on it. And that's a known vulnerability that the industry has known about for going on 3 years now, but they failed to know it was in their environment. So it's an overwhelming problem. But the benefit and kind of the good thing as a customer is that defensibility beats novelty. And that's one of the main takeaways that Ishmael Villanueva, who headed up this report, talked about. He really analyzed the data and said, organizations that invest in these key known fundamentals fared dramatically better than organizations that were trying to either reinvent the wheel or were so scared of even just approaching those fundamentals that they maybe had inaction and did not build up those fundamental defenses because they were so hyper fixated on the one-off potentials and maybe the more lofty goals of security. So at Arctic Wolf, we're really trying to make this prescriptive. We're trying to hammer those fundamentals. And that's why I call ourselves the security operations company, because we're thinking about, hey, how do these approaches, how do these best practices, how does monitoring these disparate tools and unifying them, how does that actually work in the real world for a smaller IT team, for a team that's trying to manage not just the students' laptops, but also the security of their Google Workspace or O365 email account, right? So I mentioned the K through 12 security challenges, and I'll leave these on the screen, and you're free to read these in the background. But some of the things that jump out at me is the education space is kind of walking a tightrope. In some regards, they fly under the radar, and the education world flies under the radar compared to a bank or a financial institution. And it seems like, hey, we don't really have these compliance drivers. But at the end of the day, you are dealing with your core product, if you will, which is your students, right? And your students carry with them a ton of different compliance requirements. So, the student information, that is PII, that needs to be handled carefully, both at rest and in motion. There's also the component where it's, all this is regulated from a healthcare aspect under HIPAA and under FERPA. So there are some real compliance drivers that I think a lot of people are maybe cognizant of at a high level, but then when it comes to the architecture of their cybersecurity tech stack, they maybe are unaware of how it surfaces in day-to-day security practices. The other thing that's just undeniable is the security skills gap. We understand that so often security teams at schools are asked to do a ton with very little. And they oftentimes might be a small, agile team of one or maybe two or three people that are asked to deal with this very broad list of devices, whether it's servers and desktops that you acquire from ByteSpeed, or it's the Internet of Things component with key cards and HVAC. At the end of the day, cyber attacks in the security world, from a education aspect, they really do translate into a loss of learning time. And there's been so many times that Damon and I have heard about encryption events at schools. I don't want to call this, I can't call out this school. Some of you in the audience may know this, but there was a very unique attack where a school in this region was actually breached, and they had an encryption event happen around their HVAC system. Sort of interesting, but that ended up shutting down the HVAC. Well, that didn't affect the desktops and laptops, but it was still a cybersecurity event. Well, when that incident came to fruition, they were unable to then heat the school. And they had a school-wide policy that, hey, if the temperature in the classrooms is not above 55 degrees, we can't hold school that day. That ended up translating into multiple days of downtime. And the idea of cybersecurity in a school is a really vast and encompassing idea. And we have a lot of unique ways to address that. I'll pause here for a moment and just check if there's any questions in the audience. And Damon, keep me honest on this. I don't see any.
Looks like we're good.
Cool. No. Awesome. Well, I talked a little bit about the stages of cybersecurity maturity, and the first one that I want to talk about is really stage one. We think of this as growing from least mature to most secure. And, I know this will probably seem a little daunting as you see these built out, but just know that in the background, a good partner like Arctic Wolf, we can help slingshot you very quickly from, a stage one or stage two into a stage four at a very high rate of speed. So there are partners out in the marketplace like Arctic Wolf, like others, that are able to do that. It's just a matter of kind of understanding where you fit now and where you're hoping to end up. So stage one is really all about technology. This is the lowest level of maturity, but it really means that you have a firewall. You have some kind of MFA deployed. You have, some kind of an EDR endpoint detection. But the difference between stage one and stage two is that at stage two, you now have layered or sprinkled on some services. So you might have a great endpoint, and then you go to that endpoint vendor and you say, hey, I'd like you to actually help me monitor this after hours, because I can only be here during school hours or 7 to 5, 8 to 5. I'm worried about what happens at 12 a.m. on Saturday. That's where a third party can come in and help extend that coverage, not just in terms of eyes on glass coverage, but also in terms of being able to actually monitor after hours when you and your team in-house are unable to do that. Stage three, we really get into this idea of broad detection and response. We really think of this as right of boom. The idea is that, hey, you've hired someone to help you play that never-ending game of whack-a-mole. And that's absolutely better than just having some niche siloed tools and data sets. But the idea is that now you have someone that is trying to unify some portion, hopefully all, of your attack surface. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a future slide here. Stage 4, you're really getting into left of boom exercises. So things like vulnerability scanning, things like tabletop exercises, pen testing, and then thinking about, hey, how do we train our employees to recognize something suspicious or something fishy before that actual cyber attack occurs? So many cyber attacks today, feature a human as the downfall. You want to make sure that, for example, your superintendent knows not to click on that free iPad email. That's a phishing email. You can train them before the real one comes through with various, simulations and videos and quizzes and things like that. And then at stage 5, you're really mapping to some kind of a best practice framework. These typically surface as NIST 2.0. CIS is a great example. This means that you're taking these trusted best practice frameworks and then applying those best practices to the day to day. I'm going to really focus on stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 today, but just know that all of them, the day to day activities, build up into stage 5, whether you probably realize you're doing it or not. So the first thing I want to start with, I just kind of want to ask the audience here. Feel free to type it in chat or just think about it, or you can unmute and shout it out if you want. But based on that Arctic Wolf threats report, what attack type made up the largest percentage of Arctic Wolf IR cases over the past 12 months? I'll give you a second to think about that or type it in. It could be a business email compromise, could be a data exfiltration. Let me know what your thoughts are. Okay. So the answer to that question is ransomware. And ransomware dovetails nicely with that stage 1 and stage 2 of cybersecurity maturity, because the idea is that ransomware lives on the endpoints. So the first takeaway from that Arctic Wolf trends report, threat report that I want to talk about is the idea that ransomware is occurring at a higher rate than any other type of security incident. There's a couple different things that we can, draw on that conclusion from. But the idea is that, especially in a school setting, edge devices are really something that are being exploited at a high rate. When I think about a school and an education type situation, depending on what your school policy is, you might be deploying laptops that you're providing for students. Some schools have BYOD policies. That becomes kind of this wild west of devices that are coming and going from your network. And those are the devices that you oftentimes have the least amount of control over. The other thing that we've seen over the past calendar year is that bad actors can actually automate so much of these endpoint-based attacks to cause you to not have time to actually see the bad actor in that dwell time. One of the key quotes that kind of jumped out at me is that in multiple investigations this year, Arctic Wolf observed attackers achieve domain-level control in minutes. So that speed really leaves little manual time to actually go in and investigate. It really highlights the importance that you ideally have someone that is watching that tool set with you. In the pantheon of industries affected by ransomware, education is really number 3. And that's oftentimes because these bad actors that operate at this scale now, they understand that at a typical school, at a typical education space, the defenders might only have a couple hours each week to actually dig in and look at what these events are telling them. By then, it's too late. That endpoint has been compromised. That server has been compromised. So what can we do about this? Well, the fix is really to have performant, competent, and high-fidelity endpoint defense. And ideally, that's being monitored consistently, either based on your internal team, or if you don't have the bandwidth for that, you can do that through a managed partner or some kind of a trusted advisor. So some of the features that I like to talk about that should be known in the endpoint space when you're evaluating, us or another vendor in the context of education are, does it have automated response actions, right? Is it able to do something and lock down a device when it sees a smoldering problem? Another thing I like to call out is the idea is, does it map to the MITRE attack framework? Does it map to those best practice TTPs so that when you talk to someone else in the industry, they're able to quickly understand, hey, what is going on in this attack chain? Why is this an IOC? And what is the attacker potentially doing in the future? The other piece that I like to talk about is, does it have mobile protection? So in the education space, Damon and I see this every day. So many of the students are using like Chrome OS devices. A lot of the big EDR vendors don't actually have Chromebook protection. So you should look for a vendor that does, because you want to be able to deploy endpoint protection to the student edge devices as well. And then really the other big thing that I want to call out is this idea of behavior-based protection. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but the days of signature-based EDRs, that's less relevant today. Today, we're really looking at heuristics and behavior and looking at, hey, what is this activity trying to do, as opposed to, does it match up with what we saw earlier this morning? AI has accelerated that trend. And then talking a little bit about, if you can't manage that EDR internally and monitor it at a high rate, this is really where we get into managed EDR features. And if you're evaluating any kind of a vendor in this aspect, you want to ask yourself, hey, do they have 24/7 monitoring? And it's not good enough to just have them tell you, yeah, we keep our phone on loud, and if there's a problem on Thanksgiving night, we'll wake up at 3 a.m. and look at it. They need to have the scale of SOC operations to actually monitor full eyes on glass coverage at scale during that time. And the other piece is the ongoing tuning and configuration, and then those quarterly health checks. EDR is not a set and forget solution. EDR is something that, as your personnel, as your teachers change, as roles change, as you hire someone else in the coaching staff, you want to be able to adjust the EDR based on that individual's endpoint needs, and make sure it's deployed quickly to that person's device so there's no lapses in coverage. Diving a little bit more into the heuristic and behavioral-based EDRs, like I said, the problem with signature-based EDRs, which is traditionally how EDRs have been architected, is that they're looking for a signature or a hash or some kind of an indicator today, this afternoon, based on the 72,000 novel malware samples that bad actors developed this morning. And that's only accelerated, as I mentioned, because of AI. That's really not good enough, because if you end up getting hit, even after that silent update at noon from that EDR vendor themselves, if you get hit by malware sample 72,001, you might not have effective coverage at the endpoint level. So what you really want is an EDR that takes all these scripts and files and processes and network activity, and it runs those indicators and kind of that behavior against some kind of a mathematical learning model. That way, when it sees something in the future, it can say, hey, I've never seen this type of a ransomware file before. It's not in my scripts of known indicators of compromise, but it's something that I know is trying to do something bad, and the EDR is autonomously going to take the decision to contain that endpoint, or humans in the background are able to investigate and contain that endpoint at a fast enough speed that it can prevent lateral movement within your environment. To talk a little bit just quickly about how Arctic Wolf addresses this problem, our EDR has something called Alpha AI. And we're kind of noteworthy in the EDR space, where we're actually the first organization that was applying machine learning and AI from a defender aspect to the way our EDR was architected at its core. So we've never had a signature-based detection model. We have signature-based detections, but that's not the core of what our EDR is doing. We have something that we call the Alpha AI Temporal Predictive Advantage. You can try to say that 10 times fast, but we call it the TPA for short. But the idea of the TPA is that we're able to take previous generations of that mathematical learning model and see how far in the past they would have been effective against, in this case, ransomware, before this ransomware actually hit the market. So as opposed to the signature-based styles of EDR, that they would have coverage, an hour or a day or a week after these types of ransomwares hit the market. If you take, DarkSide, for example, the version of Alpha AI that existed 62 months in the past was able to accurately identify and contain pre-execution DarkSide on an endpoint before it was able to detonate. So when you evaluate EDRs, you need to understand what is this EDR's core architecture doing. If it's just looking for signatures, it might not be true EDR. It would be what I would call, maybe an antivirus or maybe a next gen antivirus. Modern EDR is looking at heuristics and behavior. Talking a little bit more about stage 3 and kind of the idea of broad detection and response. Again, that's some form of XDR, MDR. And Damon and I, we kind of make the joke that, EDR is great, but attackers have responded. And that's really the second takeaway. A lot of times we talk to customers, especially in the education space, where they're really proud of how they've deployed EDR, and they might even have a best-in-class EDR, and that's fantastic. You should have a good EDR, and you need to have a good EDR. But if you're trying to move up the security maturity and mitigate risk at your school, you need to have some kind of an answer for some of these other, what I would call linchpins of an environment. So some of the takeaways that our threat intelligence team recommends in this area are strengthening authentication controls, requiring MFA everywhere you can. Another piece of that is actually leveraging threat intelligence and saying, hey, you should pick a partner that has a robust security and threat intelligence division that's able to say, hey, these are developing trends that we've seen over the past week, month, quarter, and we can update our detections and how we're analyzing our customers' data and our customers' behavior in light of these new threats that are just hitting the market from the bad actors. One of the quotes I really liked in here is that, from the vantage point of Arctic Wolf Labs, attackers are compressing the kill chain, and they're doing that through automation. They're bypassing controls by logging in and not breaking it. So a lot of times they're not smashing a window and actually hacking in, again, in kind of that CSI episode type mentality. They're purchasing compromised credentials on the dark web, and they're going into your Google Workspace or into a O365 environment, and they're able to do that with very little defensive capabilities because they're doing that without ever touching an EDR that school might actually have deployed. And then the other thing is, again, they're exploiting those actual linchpins. So things like remote access, things like trusted platforms, and then really exploiting identity, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a moment here. So off of this takeaway, what's our recommendation? It's really about extending updated security monitoring to the linchpins of a modern attack surface. So I'm going to ask the audience right now, in your mind, what is your definition of MDR? What does it encompass? What does it mean? I'll give you guys a moment to think about that. So Damon and I talk to people every day in this space, and we get a lot of feedback on this, and it's always interesting what MDR means to them. I like to make the joke as an engineer. Again, I live and breathe this, so I'm immersed in it every day. But I always kind of make the joke that, MDR, XDR, ABCDR, there are so many different versions of this MDR, XDR idea. When you pull back the wizard's curtain on a given solution, so often it ends up being like managed EDR. Or maybe it's managed EDR, and then we're able to also take in some of those firewall alerts. In the Arctic Wolf world, we've addressed this by understanding, hey, let's take a look at this wheel. And this wheel has been kind of drafted up to be like a typical cybersecurity tech stack, right? The idea behind this is it's not true MDR from the Arctic Wolf standpoint unless you have some kind of an answer for every component of, again, this traditionally siloed, disparate tool set that makes up a given attack surface. And again, talking about that previous takeaway I had on the previous slide, the problem with even managed EDR is that bad actors have responded accordingly. So if they get into a given environment or they're doing recon on a given environment and they see that you have a great endpoint and it's deployed everywhere, they are not going to sit there and just try to knife fight that endpoint. They're going to flip to page 4 of their attack booklet and they're going to do some kind of an attack that the attack chain actually circumvents that endpoint entirely. And Damon and I see this all the time. So to give you a hypothetical one, they're going to flip to page 4 and they're going to say, hey, I know that this given EDR vendor does not have any kind of network-based detections because they're an EDR and they kind of operate under the philosophy that the endpoint is the end-all be-all. So for example, maybe they do a network-based attack and they use that to do a low and slow MFA fatigue attack on one of your employees, one of your teachers. And that teacher, again, because it's low and slow, it doesn't set off the rule sets and parameters of your Okta or your Duo or your Microsoft, for example. So then they get credentialed access to that teacher's email. And from there, they have really carte blanche, with the identity being the linchpin, into so many of these trusted SaaS platforms that your team is probably using for their education responsibilities. So maybe they do a business email compromise through Google Workspace, or they send out a malicious file to trusted, VIPs in the school district. Those types of attack chains would not be defended very well by EDR because, again, it circumvents EDR entirely in these types of attack chains. At Arctic Wolf, 13 years ago when we started out, we strategically made the decision to not make any kind of a tool. Now that's changed recently because, again, we have an EDR, and that is available, again, in both a managed and an unmanaged flavoring. And that's better than having no defenses. But to us, it's not true EDR unless you have some kind of unifying solution, cross-correlating and triangulating these disparate data points. So 13 years ago, we started off making this centrifuge, which is our Arctic Wolf platform. And the idea of the Arctic Wolf platform is that we have rule sets and parameters that are built there that go above and beyond what these first-party logos are telling us. And from there, we're able to actually do something earlier in attack chains than when a first-party logo does raise its hand and say, hey, it's a code red alert. So I'll give you an example of this. Maybe there's a very low-level attack on the endpoint, and there's a nibble, for a lack of a better technical term. There's a nibble on the endpoint, but it doesn't set off CrowdStrike or Sophos or SentinelOne or Trend Micro. Concurrently, there's a nibble on your firewall, but it doesn't set off SonicWall or Fortinet or Palo or Meraki. And at the same time, concurrently, there's a nibble on the identity, but it doesn't happen at a cadence that's frequent enough to actually set off Azure or Microsoft or Okta or Duo. Well, those first-party tools are not alerting on that, but when you take that telemetry and you have it cross-correlated and parsed and enriched in the Arctic Wolf MDR platform, we're able to say, hey, this isn't on fire yet, but this is an observation of note. Let's get the humans, those 1,000+ security analysts and engineers, in to actually make sense of this and get eyes on glass to start investigating. And then from there, we have containment capabilities. So at Arctic Wolf, for example, we can contain on the endpoint. We can contain identity. We can contain emails. We can contain servers. We can also contain network traffic, which is a huge piece of a modern education tech stack. Again, you have keycard swipers, you have the fire alarm system, you have the HVAC system, like that example I talked about earlier. We actually have not just integrations into all of these logos, for example, Palo or Fortinet or Meraki, but we also have a fully managed IDS appliance. And that really goes typically span mirror off of your core switch. And that's looking at granular network traffic for real world cyber attack indicators. So C2 traffic, data exfiltration attempts. We're able to block traffic with that IDS appliance. And that's a really key piece of what we do when we defend our education space customers, because that network traffic is so often a blind spot. So really to close this out, the problem with a lot of education current tech stacks is that you might have deployed a bunch of niche, really good, best in class tool sets, but there's nobody that's cross correlating and unifying and triangulating that telemetry to give you a full 360-degree view of what's going on in your environment. That's where an MDR provider comes in and makes sense of all that alert fatigue and all that noise. If I can summarize what a good MDR provider does with a single slide, I really like this slide, which I kind of call our funnel diagram. This is written in the context of Arctic Wolf, but again, these are some big picture ideas that you should carry with to whoever you're evaluating. So a good MDR provider is going to take in unlimited telemetry. They're not going to charge you for data ingestion. And they're going to take that telemetry in from a wide host of components of your environment. So things like your firewall, your IoT devices, your SaaS apps, your cloud apps. They're going to take all that telemetry and they're going to start comparing it, sometimes as many as 10 million weekly observations when you look at all those tool sets combined. And they're going to look at not just on the nose cyber attack features like ransomware or malware or data exfiltration attempts, but they're also going to look for, unauthorized access or credential theft or Superman attacks, for example. And they're going to parse out from that 10 million weekly observations, what do we need to investigate? Again, you've theoretically hired them as a partner. You should not be dealing with 10 somewhat related alerts hitting your inbox all at once. You want your provider to have done the investigation, the contextualization, and then really serve you up on a platter what needs to be actually actioned each week. So at Arctic Wolf, we've looked at our metrics, and the average Arctic Wolf customer, because we have a 99.9% true positive rate on our ticketing, they get between 1 and 3 full comprehension true positive tickets per week. And in those tickets, we not only tell them the where, the when, and the how we detected it, but we also talk about, hey, here's what it means from a big picture, and here's what you can do about it, not just in terms of the remediation instructions for that acute ticket, but we also talk about in the future, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. And that's really where our concierge security team delivery model comes into play. On top of the 1,000+ security engineers and analysts, we have industry specialists. So I know I'm talking to an education audience right now. Our concierge security team, we have experts in the security world around education that would be assigned to your account. You'd get 3 of those individuals. You'd get to know them on a first name basis. You'd get to understand, they'd get to understand your security hopes and dreams, if you will. And they're helping you make proactive, cooperative, and really bespoke posture management improvements, both informally after a ticket comes in and something actually happened, but also long term and looking ahead. Maybe you implemented, firewalls 6 years ago, but nobody's revisited those configurations. Our concierge security team, or a vendor that you choose that should be doing that, they're there to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, I think those sonic wall firewalls need to be updated based on, X, Y, and Z that we've seen in the threat security landscape developing over the past 6 months. That's really changing the paradigm of MDR from a reactive, never-ending whack-a-mole game to something that actually gives your security posture improvement on a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter, semester-to-semester, year-to-year basis. So that's something we take really seriously at Arctic Wolf. And then talking a little bit about stage 4, this is really, again, getting into the posture management activities. This is getting into the proactive side. We do a lot of that here at Arctic Wolf, even with our core MDR solution, but we also have solutions around employee training, vulnerability management, and tabletop exercises as well. So the third takeaway is that vulnerability management is still being neglected. And I kind of like to think of this, I would almost make the argument that the cybersecurity industry in general is actually doing a really good job today in 2026 thinking about, hey, I need to monitor my environment. But that's from an acute standpoint. I mentioned this earlier, but I think the downfall of a lot of the customers that we see are now Arctic Wolf customers, I should say, that were non-Arctic Wolf customers that had a serious breach occur. It's that they might be doing some kind of acute monitoring, but they're not doing anything to actually manage those vulnerabilities. And there might be a CVE that has a 2022 timestamp on it that lives in their environment, but they don't actually know that exists. So if there's one of the biggest takeaways that I can stress from that from that threat report, it's that patching pays off. So yes, while new exploits absolutely deserve attention and they do come out each year, there are always zero-day attacks. Every single one of the CVEs that we encountered the most in the top 10 CVEs that we saw exploited were from 2024 or earlier. So we're not just talking about a vulnerability management problem of a couple months or a couple weeks. We're talking about an industry-wide multi-year lag in addressing these core vulnerabilities that are known, documented, but just unseen in a given environment. So one of the biggest takeaways that we have in terms of recommendations is prioritizing patching in general and having some kind of a comprehensive solution that can scan your entire environment and surface to you what needs your attention in terms of a prioritization. One of the biggest ways that we do that is us and any other, vulnerability management provider that's worth their salt. They're going to heavily lean on CISA's KEV, or known exploited vulnerabilities category, which basically says this is a vulnerability and the CISA KEV is positive, which means it has been seen exploited in the wild. So I always make this joke. There might be a lot of, super high level critical vulnerabilities in a given environment, but if they're CISA KEV negative, that means that a middle tier medium vulnerability that is CISA KEV positive is significantly more pressing, because that's going to be your downfall. Those other ones may be buried too far in your environment to actually be leveraged in a real world cyber attack. So you need to look for a partner that's able to help you parse out the vast vulnerabilities that might exist in your environment and draw a conclusive game plan to go after the ones that matter. So the fix for this is finding a solution that allows actual progress on vulnerability management. I'm going to use our Arctic Wolf managed risk solution as an example of this and really talk about like the pinnacles that I think should be included in any, vulnerability managed solution that you have. The first three are really the core pillars of where the scans should be taking place. So there should be external vulnerability scans. Those are things that are looking at dark web, gray web, account takeover potential, and then doing perimeter scanning. So from the outside in and looking for port vulnerabilities or things that in your network might not have been switched off. Internal vulnerability assessments really get into this idea of, hey, you have a core switch that has lagging firmware on it. You have a firewall that hasn't been updated in 5 years. That's scanning the devices and especially the IoT components in a school for, hey, there's a vulnerability on this printer. Somebody needs to go over and update that firmware from, Toshiba or whoever the vendor is. And then secondarily or tertiary, the host-based scan capability. So there should be consistent, preferably daily scans of the endpoints themselves that are able to say, hey, this endpoint has an expired version of Google Chrome on it. Maybe it's a 6-month-old version of Google Chrome, and we know that bad actors are targeting that make and model of Google Chrome. That CISA KEV score is positive. Let's elevate that to actually have remediation efforts from the security team. Other things to look for in vulnerability solutions, asset criticality and asset tagging, mapping out your environment and understanding, hey, this is at the middle school and the high school has a different set of servers. So when I actually go to do these remediations, I want to make sure that I'm doing what's applicable to the given location that I'm at. Another piece is OWASP top 10 scanning, looking for those top 10 consistently exploited vulnerability types. And then another thing that I really like to mention is the management plan itself. That, in the Arctic Wolf case, that same concierge security team that I mentioned when I was talking about managed detection and response, that same team is unified with you across your different Arctic Wolf services. So that team is helping you sit down and say, yes, we just ran, we're glad you joined Arctic Wolf. We just ran that first vulnerability scan. It's true, you have 500 critical vulnerabilities, but 400 of them would be remediated by this same Microsoft patch. So a trusted partner, a good partner, is helping you make sense of how do I paint with the broadest brushstrokes to make actual actionable progress on these vulnerabilities that I have. So to summarize, I know I've been talking kind of agnostically about the industry in general, but to really summarize what it is that we do at Arctic Wolf, I have here kind of built out the 5 solutions and services that we have. And I'll say a few things about each of them. Again, we'd be happy to talk to you if any of them are interesting to you. So the first solution that we have, again, we do have an EDR. It's called Aurora Endpoint Defense. It's based on it's architected on a very unique machine learning and AI model. It comes in 2 different flavorings. One is an unmanaged version that would be on your team to monitor, but we would help you extensively with the deployment process. And I think that's a really key point to mention. A lot of other EDR vendors, they're going to give you the software key, they're going to sell you a software key, and then they're going to leave you to your own devices. We take the onboarding piece, even with our unmanaged offering, very seriously, because we see that being the actual downfall for many small agile security teams. And then again, we also have a managed version of that offering where you could leverage those 1,000+ security analysts and engineers to monitor those EDR, to monitor those endpoints round the clock. We would also have containment capabilities then, so that even when your team is hopefully not in the office on Thanksgiving break, Arctic Wolf would always be monitoring your environment round the clock. I talked a little bit about managed detection and response. Again, we have a managed detection and response offering that takes in telemetry from across the broad attack surface, including that all-important identity piece. We parse and enrich that telemetry, and then we have containment capabilities across different aspects of that environment. So that I like to make the analogy, if a grenade gets thrown into your environment, Arctic Wolf is always there to, at a very high rate of speed, throw the bucket over that grenade and contain that shrapnel and blast radius, and then serve you on a platter a single full comprehension ticket that gives you the where, when, and what to do about it from that given event. I also like to mention that we have unlimited log ingestion. We don't charge based on ingestion rates like a lot of traditional SIEMs. We want to be able to cover your entire attack surface. I talked a little bit about managed risk a moment ago. Again, there's 3 core buckets to that: external vulnerability assessments, internal vulnerability assessments, and then host-based assessments. That same team that's working with you from a strategic angle with managed detection and response, they're also with you for all of these solutions, but critically with managed risk, helping you make actual actionable progress on what you're trying to accomplish. We do have an employee training solution. This is really a micro-learning approach, and it's fully managed by us. We have our own content studio that's able to film and generate, quizzes and videos and topics at a very high rate of speed based on what that Arctic Wolf threat intelligence team is actually seeing in the cybersecurity landscape. And that also includes phishing simulation. So it's a fully managed approach to your employee training needs, unlike a lot of our competitors that often become, it's somewhat of a curation nightmare, or it's on you as the IT or a security professional to actually curate and manage the sending of that vast library of content that has been dumped onto your lap. And then I mentioned this at the start, we do have a full in-house incident response team. This surfaces in a couple different ways. For non-Arctic Wolf customers, they can get access to a series of retainers that give them things like top-of-line access to our team. It can cover you for the entire cost of a breach, for example, and it can also do tabletop exercises on a lot of the things that your cyber insurer may be asking you to have from an incident response planning aspect. And then for current Arctic Wolf customers, we have a very unique security operations warranty. Again, with these other four services, we are in the business of preventing breaches, but undeniably, no one in my seat can guarantee your cybersecurity. If something were to occur on Arctic Wolf's watch, we would actually be there to stand in with real world dollars backing our service to help you get back up and running before you'd have to go to a cybersecurity or your cyber insurance. I'll hand this off to Damon for a moment here for next steps.
Yep. Thank you, Mitch. Appreciate that. So from a call to action standpoint, everyone, it's pretty simple from steps. If you resonated with some of these areas, potential gaps within your school's security needs, there's ways within those services that we can help out. And through ByteSpeed and their partnership with Vita Learn and the consortium pricing that they have available to them, there's an opportunity to increase your security at the school than it is today. So the steps are pretty simple. You can reach out to ByteSpeed, Corbin, Duncan. You can reach out to Arctic Wolf, Mitch, myself. You can visit the Vita Learn site, and I have a link to that below that I will be sending out as a follow-up. There's some pre-meeting information, a questionnaire, really just understanding what services are you interested in, what is the scope of the school, how big of an organization is it, so we can get you in front of the right resources, and then what is the timing of a project like this, so we can make the most of that conversation with you. And then from there, we can connect you with the right resources on the ByteSpeed and Arctic Wolf team and discuss the pricing and the solutions that are fit to the school. And you can see highlighted here, this is on the Vita Learn site as well, but there's a $18 a user savings for the security awareness training program. The typical price is $30, so a really good pricing opportunity there. A jump start into the retainer world to be able to build a cyber insurance plan and then have full access to that Arctic Wolf IR team in the event that something were to happen with that jump start retainer. That offering is $3,000 annually. And then from a managed detection response and some of the other services, there's just additional scoping information that would be needed to get the pricing built out, but you would have consortium pricing for that solution. So that's the call to action. We really appreciate everybody's time. And if there's questions or anything like that, please let us know and we'd be happy to answer them for you.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we do.
Hey, I just thought I'd let you know, my chat's been disabled. I haven't ignored you. But I'll get back to you about pricing and things. Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate the time, Abigail. Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. Take care.